I always liked camping alone. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy company, but there was something about being out in the wilderness with nothing but my own thoughts and the quiet hum of nature that felt right. I had been camping for years, ever since I was a kid. My dad had taken me on my first trip when I was 8, and I had been hooked ever since. By the time I was in my late 30s, I had lost count of how many times I had gone out into the wild, setting up camp miles away from the nearest road, away from any signs of civilization. I liked the solitude, the challenge of surviving on my own, and the peace that came with being completely off the grid. That's why, when I decided to take a trip to the dense forests of northern Montana, I didn't hesitate. I had been there once before, years ago, and I remembered how untouched it felt. No marked trails, no designated campsites, just miles and miles of raw wilderness. It was exactly the kind of place I wanted to be. I packed light but smart. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for the cold nights, a solid hunting knife, a small axe for cutting wood, a water purifier, and enough food to last me a week. I had a map, but I rarely relied on it. I had a good sense of direction and a GPS just in case. My plan was simple. Hike deep into the woods, set up camp by a small river I had marked on my map, and spend a few days enjoying the solitude before heading back. I started early in the morning. The hike was tough, but I had done worse. The terrain was steep in some areas, with thick underbrush that made progress slow. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. By mid-afternoon, I had reached the river. It was just as I remembered. Cold, clear water cutting through the forest, surrounded by towering pines and thick brush. I found a good spot to set up camp, a small clearing about 50 feet from the water, with a natural windbreak formed by a rock outcropping. It was perfect. I spent the rest of the day setting up camp, gathering firewood, and making sure everything was secure. By nightfall, I had a small fire going and was cooking one of my meals over it. The temperature had dropped, but the fire kept me warm. I sat there for a long time, just listening to the sounds of the forest, the occasional rustling in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl, the steady flow of the river. It wasn't until I was about to turn in for the night that I noticed something strange. The forest had gone silent. I didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes the sounds of nature came and went. But as I listened, I realized that it wasn't just a brief lull. There was nothing. No wind in the trees, no insects buzzing, no movement in the brush. It was as if everything had stopped. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But I had been camping long enough to know that when the forest goes silent, something is usually wrong. It could be a predator, maybe a bear, maybe a mountain lion. I reached for my knife and kept it close as I crawled into my tent. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, faint, almost like footsteps, but not quite. It was too irregular, too deliberate. But every time I sat up to listen, it was gone. Eventually, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows through the trees. Everything felt normal again. Birds were chirping, and the forest had come back to life. I convinced myself that it had just been my imagination and went about my day. I spent the morning fishing in the river and caught a decent-sized trout. I cleaned it, cooked it over the fire, and ate in silence. The day passed without incident. I hiked around, explored the area, and enjoyed the solitude. By evening, I was back at my campsite, watching the fire crackle as the sky darkened. That's when I noticed it. There was something in the trees. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but the more I looked, the more certain I became. There was something standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the fading light. It wasn't an animal. It was tall, too tall to be anything normal. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape standing motionless among the trees. My heart started pounding. I reached for my knife again, gripping it tightly. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just sat there, staring at whatever it was. Then, as quickly as I had noticed it, it was gone. I stayed up late that night, keeping the fire high. Every now and then, I thought I heard something. Faint rustling, distant movement, but nothing ever came close. By the third day, I was on edge. Every little sound put me on alert. I kept scanning the trees, looking for anything unusual. I didn't see the figure again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I barely slept. I kept my knife within arm's reach and woke up every hour, listening. The silence would come and go, and every time it did, I felt my skin crawl. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was cutting my trip short. I packed up quickly, checking my surroundings every few minutes. I kept my knife out as I started the long hike back. The whole time, I felt like I was being followed. I didn't see anything, didn't hear anything, but the feeling never left me. As I got closer to where I had parked, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were tracks, not animal tracks, footprints, human, but they weren't mine, and they weren't fresh. They had been there before I arrived. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. They led into the forest, toward where I had been camping. Whoever or whatever had been out there had been there before I even arrived. I didn't stop to think. I kept moving, walking faster, pushing through the last stretch of the hike until I finally saw my truck. I threw my gear into the back, climbed in, and drove away without looking back. I don't know what was out there. I don't know if it was a person or something else. I just know that something had been watching me the entire time. And the worst part, I hadn't been alone in those woods, not even from the start. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away from everything. I had planned it for weeks. Just me, my tent, and the sound of rain in the middle of nowhere. I always loved the rain, especially while camping. Something about being tucked away in a tent, listening to the steady drumming on the canvas, made me feel at peace. I had chosen a spot deep in the woods, far from any main roads or crowded campsites. It wasn't an official camping ground, just a clearing near a slow-moving river that I had found on a map. The weather forecast predicted rain, but I didn't mind. I had my gear, enough food for a couple of days, and a reliable old truck that had never let me down. I arrived in the early afternoon, just as the sky turned gray. The air smelled like wet earth, and the wind carried the scent of pine and damp leaves. I parked my truck at the edge of the clearing and got to work setting up my tent. The ground was damp but not soaked, and I managed to get everything up before the rain started. By the time I got a small fire going, the first drops were falling. I sat on a foldable camping chair, listening to the distant sound of rain moving through the trees. It started slow, just a light drizzle, but by the time the sun dipped below the treetops, it had turned into a steady downpour. I moved inside my tent, zipped it up tight, and stretched out on my sleeping bag. The rain hit the fabric in a soothing rhythm, and I felt myself relax. I had a small lantern for light and a book to pass the time, but after a while I just lay there listening to the storm. It must have been close to midnight when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just the wind or an animal moving through the undergrowth. But then I heard it again, footsteps, slow, deliberate, not the uneven scurrying of an animal, but something else, something heavier. I held my breath, straining to hear over the rain. The sound was faint, almost lost beneath the downpour, but it was there. Someone or something was walking just beyond my tent. I reached for the small knife I always kept in my bag. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. My heart pounded as I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe the rain playing tricks on me. Then I heard it again, closer, I wanted to unzip the tent and look, but something stopped me. A feeling, like the air had changed. The footsteps had been moving toward my truck. I stayed still, listening. The rain made it hard to tell how far away it was, but I could hear something near the truck. A soft metallic sound. The door handle. I swallowed hard. Then silence. No footsteps. No rustling. Just the rain. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. I was frozen, every muscle in my body locked in place. I thought about calling out, but the words never came. Then, another sound. This time from the other side of my tent. A slow, dragging noise. Something moving through the wet grass. I gripped the knife tighter. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I could hear my own heartbeat now, louder than the rain. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence again. The rain still fell, but nothing else moved. I waited, barely breathing. Then I heard my truck door open. I bolted upright. The truck wasn't locked. I never locked it out here, never thought I needed to. My mind raced. If someone was out there, they could be going through my things. Or worse, waiting for me to step out. I stayed still, gripping my knife, my ears straining for any sound. The truck door didn't close. It just stayed open, letting the rain in. I waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Nothing. I forced myself to move, to peek out of the tent. The truck was barely visible in the darkness, its outline lit by flashes of lightning. The door was open, just as I had heard, but no one was there. I scanned the tree line, my pulse hammering in my chest. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. That deep, gut-level feeling that someone was watching. I had to make a decision. Stay in the tent and hope whoever was out there left, or make a run for the truck and get the hell out. I chose the truck. I moved fast, heart pounding, feet splashing through the mud. I climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it. The keys were still in the cup holder. I grabbed them with shaking hands and turned the ignition. The engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. A cold weight settled in my stomach. I had never had trouble with this truck before. Lightning flashed, and for a split second, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A shape, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, too far to make out details, but close enough to know they were watching me. Then the darkness swallowed them again. I tried the engine one more time, coughed, then roared to life. I didn't hesitate. I threw it into reverse, backing up fast, the tires slipping in the mud. Then I turned onto the dirt road, speeding away from the clearing, away from whatever had been out there. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, my hands gripping the wheel so tight they ached. Only then did I breathe, my body shaking with adrenaline. I never went back to that spot, never even drove near it again. The next morning, after I had calmed down, I told myself it had been a drifter, maybe a thief looking for an easy target, maybe someone just passing through. But deep down, I knew, whoever they were, they hadn't just been passing through. They had been waiting, and I had almost stayed long enough to find out why. I don't know what made me decide to go camping alone that weekend. Maybe it was the stress from work. Maybe I just wanted to be by myself for a while to clear my mind. Either way, I packed up my truck with enough gear for a couple of nights and headed out toward the mountains. The place I had in mind wasn't a proper campground. It was deep in the woods, away from the main trails, a spot I had found a few years back when hiking with some friends. It wasn't on any map, but I had marked it in my head. It was quiet, surrounded by thick forest, and had a small creek running nearby. I figured it would be the perfect place to unwind. The drive took about 4 hours, most of it on winding roads through the trees. The last stretch was a rough dirt path, barely wide enough for my truck. It was the kind of road that made you question whether you should keep going, with deep potholes and loose gravel. I kept driving until I reached a clearing that I remembered from my last trip. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees. I killed the engine and got out. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The only sounds were the distant chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was exactly what I needed. I spent the next hour setting up my tent and gathering some wood for a fire. The temperature was dropping quickly, and I wanted to get the flames going before it got too cold. By the time the fire was crackling, the sun had vanished, leaving only the faint glow of twilight. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal and watching the flames dance. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. Out there, you start to notice just how loud silence can be. Every creak of a tree, every snap of a twig, makes you listen a little harder. As the night stretched on, the wind picked up, whistling through the branches. I checked my watch, almost midnight. I decided to call it a night and crawled into my tent. The sleeping bag was warm, but the ground beneath me was hard and uneven. I shifted a few times, trying to get comfortable. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure what had startled me. The fire outside had died down to glowing embers, casting faint shadows across the inside of the tent. Then I heard it, a sound in the distance. At first, it was hard to place, just a faint rustling, like wind through the trees. But as I lay there, holding my breath, I realized it was something moving, something walking. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, but the steps sounded too deliberate, slow, measured, not the quick, darting movements of a startled creature. I reached for my flashlight, but I stopped myself from turning it on. A part of me didn't want to see what was out there. The sound got closer. My heart pounded in my chest. I could hear every breath I took, feel the sweat forming on my skin despite the cold. The steps stopped just outside my tent. I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing. Then suddenly, footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just lay there, listening as the sound faded into the distance. When it was finally gone, I let out a slow, shaky breath. I told myself it was probably just an animal, coyote or something, but deep down I knew that wasn't right. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn crept through the fabric of my tent, I finally unzipped the entrance and stepped outside. The ground was damp with morning dew, and the air was still. I looked around, trying to shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. That's when I saw them. Footprints, not boot prints, bare feet. They led from the tree line to my tent and then back into the woods. My stomach turned. I needed to leave. I packed up as fast as I could, shoving everything into my backpack with shaking hands. The whole time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. But no one was there. The drive back felt longer than before. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me down the narrow dirt road. But there was nothing. When I finally made it home, I locked my doors and shut the curtains. I sat on my couch, staring at the floor, trying to make sense of what had happened. I never went back to that spot, and I don't think I ever will. I was never someone who scared easily. I spent most weekends in the woods, camping alone or with friends, and I had been doing it since I was a teenager. I knew how to set up a tent in the dark, how to track game, and how to stay calm in emergencies. The woods weren't something I feared. They were a second home to me, but this time was different. This time I saw something, or rather someone, that I still can't explain. It happened in 2019. I had decided to camp alone for the weekend in a remote forest in Montana. I'd been to this spot a couple of times before, and it was one of my favorites. Secluded, quiet, and untouched by tourists. I packed light. A tent, a sleeping bag, a small cooler with food, and my hunting knife, which I always carried just in case. I didn't plan on hunting, but you never go into the woods without a knife. The drive took about 5 hours from my house. The last stretch was a narrow dirt road winding through thick trees, barely wide enough for my truck. I parked in a small clearing, grabbed my gear, and hiked in a couple of miles until I found a flat, open space near a creek. The sun was beginning to set, casting a deep orange glow through the trees as I set up my tent. By the time I got a fire going, the temperature had dropped. I sat by the flames, eating a sandwich and listening to the sounds of the woods. Crickets, a distant owl, the soft rustling of leaves as the wind moved through the trees. It was peaceful. At least it was at first. About an hour after sunset, I started hearing something else. At first, it was just a faint snap of a twig somewhere behind my tent. Not unusual. Animals move through the forest at night all the time. But then, a few minutes later, I heard it again. Closer. Another snap. Then silence. I sat up, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. The woods were thick, and I couldn't see much beyond the flickering glow of the flames. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and slowly scanned the trees. Nothing. I told myself it was just a deer or a raccoon, maybe sniffing around for food, but something about it felt off. The woods have a rhythm, an unspoken language. The way an animal moves, the way the forest reacts. I'd spent enough time outside to know when something wasn't right. And right now, something wasn't right. I let the fire burn down a bit, keeping the flashlight in my lap. I wasn't exactly scared yet, but I was alert. I decided to wait, to listen, and then I heard footsteps. Not the quick, light steps of an animal. These were slow, deliberate, and human. They came from the trees maybe 20 or 30 feet away. A soft crunch, then a pause. Another step, another pause. Someone was watching me. I held my breath, barely blinking. The fire crackled beside me, but the woods were silent now. Even the crickets had stopped. I raised the flashlight again, shining it toward the sound. And that's when I saw him, a man, standing just beyond the trees. He was tall, thin. His clothes were dark, and his face was wrong, like his skin was stretched too tight over his skull. He wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden in the shadows, staring at me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I've run into other campers before. People hiking through the woods, hunters looking for game. But this was different. This man wasn't carrying gear.
No backpack, no flashlight, no visible weapon.
He wasn't walking like someone who was just passing through. He was waiting, watching. I didn't move. My hand tightened around my knife. I didn't want to speak. I had no idea how he would react. Instead, I just sat there, staring back at him. A minute passed, maybe two, and then he turned and walked away. Not hurried, not startled, just slow. He disappeared into the trees without a sound. I let out a shaky breath. My heart was pounding now. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, to grab my things and get the hell out of there. But it was pitch black, and hiking back to my truck in the dark wasn't an option. I would have to wait until morning. So I did the only thing I could. I put the fire out. I sat in the dark, knife in hand, and I waited. I didn't sleep. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something. A faint movement, a shift in the leaves. But nothing ever came close again. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I was already packing. I shoved everything into my bag, barely even bothering to fold my tent. I just wanted to leave. The hike back to my truck felt twice as long. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see him again. But the woods were empty, normal. It wasn't until I reached my truck that I let myself breathe. I tossed my gear into the back, started the engine, and tore out of there, not stopping until I was miles away. I never reported it. What would I say? That some strange man was watching me? That I was scared? It wasn't illegal to be in the woods. But something about him, about that night, has stayed with me. I've been camping hundreds of times, but I've never gone back to that spot, and I never will. I was never the kind of guy who scared easy. I grew up hunting in the deep woods, spending weeks at a time in places where most people wouldn't dare step foot. I had been in storms that felt like the sky itself was cracking open. I had heard the distant howls of wolves in the dead of night. I had seen bears tear through tents for scraps of food. Nothing ever really got to me, but what happened that night in the mountains, what I saw, what I heard, that still follows me. I was 34 then, working a construction job in Montana. The pay was decent, and I had built a life out there. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom place near the edge of town. But I didn't need much. The mountains were my real home. Whenever I got time off, I'd pack up my gear, drive out into the wilderness, and disappear for a few days. I had a favorite spot about a 5-hour drive from where I lived. It was remote, tucked between two ridges, with a stream that cut through a thick patch of pines. It was perfect. No people, no noise, just the wild. I had been there at least a dozen times before, and every trip was the same. Hike in, set up camp, hunt a little, fish a little, sleep under the stars. Simple. But this time, something felt different from the start. The moment I stepped out of my truck, I noticed it. The woods were quiet. Too quiet. Normally, you hear birds chirping, leaves rustling, maybe a squirrel darting through the underbrush. But there was none of that. Just silence. Thick, heavy silence. I brushed it off. Maybe it was the weather. The sky had that dull gray look, like it was deciding whether to rain or not. I grabbed my pack, checked my rifle, and started hiking. It was late afternoon by the time I reached my usual campsite. The ground was dry, the stream was running strong, and everything looked normal. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and got ready to settle in for the night. Then I found the tracks. They weren't deer tracks. They weren't bear tracks. They looked wrong. At first glance, they seemed like coyote prints. Paws pressed deep into the mud near the water. But the longer I stared, the more I noticed the details. The shape was off. The spacing was strange. The claws were too long, too sharp. And then there was the size. Coyotes weren't that big. I tried to shake it off. Could have been a wolf. Could have been anything. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. By nightfall, the wind had picked up. I got a fire going, cooked a quick meal, and sat by the flames, listening. Still no sounds.
No crickets, no owls.
Just the crackle of burning wood and the wind moving through the trees. Then I heard it. A whistle. Not the kind the wind makes. Not the high-pitched screech of a bird. This was different. It was human. Slow. Deliberate. It came from somewhere deep in the trees. I sat up, gripping my rifle, staring into the darkness. My fire barely reached beyond the first few trees, and past that, there was nothing but black. I held my breath, waiting. The whistle came again. Closer. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the dark, landing on nothing but branches and trunks. But something felt off, like I was being watched. I stayed up for hours, staring into the woods, listening. The whistling didn't come back, but I didn't sleep that night. Morning came and I felt like hell. I had barely closed my eyes, and my nerves were shot. I decided to go hunting, partly because I needed food, but mostly because I wanted to clear my head. The forest felt different in the daylight, less threatening, more familiar. I followed a game trail, rifle ready, moving slow. I was about 2 miles from camp when I saw it. A man. He was standing about 100 yards ahead, half hidden behind a tree. He was tall, skinny, wearing old, ragged clothes. His skin looked wrong, too pale, too stretched. I called out to him, raising a hand. No response. He just stood there. I took a step closer, gripping my rifle. Then he moved, not like a person, not like anything I had ever seen. It was fast, jerky, like his limbs didn't work right. 1 second he was behind the tree, the next he was gone. I spun in a circle, scanning the trees, but he was nowhere, just gone. I should have left right then. I should have turned back, packed up my gear, and gotten the hell out of there. But I didn't. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was dipping behind the ridge. I kept telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was some hiker passing through. I forced myself to eat, forced myself to drink. Then the smell hit me. Rot, like something had died and had been left to bake in the sun. It was strong, overwhelming. It made my stomach turn. I looked around, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. Just trees, my tent, my fire. Then I saw the tracks. They were right by my camp, deep in the dirt. The same ones I had seen by the stream. Something had been here. Something had been watching me. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight, heart pounding. I wasn't running. If there was something out there, I was gonna find it. I moved through the trees, scanning the ground, searching for any sign of movement. The smell was everywhere now, thick and suffocating. Then I heard it. Not a whistle this time. A voice. My own voice, came from deep in the trees, mimicking me, calling my own name. My blood went cold. I turned and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, breathing hard, my flashlight bouncing with every step. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I never packed up my gear. I never looked back. I just drove. I never went back to that spot, never even drove near it. A few weeks later, I told a buddy what happened. He grew up on a reservation not far from there. He didn't laugh. He didn't call me crazy. He just nodded and said, "You saw it." I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. I was 22 when we went on that camping trip, back when life felt like it was just starting. It was supposed to be a break, a weekend away from assignments, exams, and everything else that came with college. There were 4 of us, me, James, Alex, and Tyler. We had been friends since freshman year, always finding some excuse to get away from campus whenever we could. This time, James had the idea to go camping deep in the woods near a lake about 2 hours from where we lived. None of us were expert campers, but we had been on enough trips to know the basics. We packed light, some food, water, a tent, and a few essentials. The plan was simple. Drive out early Friday morning, hike for a couple of hours, set up camp, spend 2 nights, and head back Sunday afternoon. It was supposed to be easy. The drive was long, mostly empty roads lined with thick trees. The further we went, the less civilization we saw. No houses, no stores, not even gas stations for miles. Just the road and the trees. At first, it felt exciting. The whole point was to disconnect, to get away from everything. But at some point, maybe an hour into the drive, the silence in the car felt heavier. The trees were too dense, the road too empty. It was like we had left the world behind. We reached the trailhead around noon, parked the car in a small gravel lot, and started hiking. The trail wasn't marked, but James had done his research and claimed he knew where he was going. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, and the deeper we went, the more overgrown it became. It was clear that not many people hiked this way. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I've been in the woods before, and there's always some kind of noise, birds, insects, the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as we walked, the silence felt unnatural. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. It took about 3 hours to reach the lake. It was beautiful, wide, still untouched. No docks, no boats, nothing. Just water surrounded by trees. We found a clearing near the shore and set up our tent. The sun was still high in the sky, so we decided to explore a little. Tyler and Alex went to gather firewood, while James and I walked along the shore. That's when I noticed something strange. The ground near the water was soft, damp from where the lake had receded. But there were footprints in the mud, deep, uneven. They weren't ours. They were old but still visible. I couldn't tell how many people had made them, but they led from the tree line to the water's edge and then disappeared. No prints coming back. James saw them too. We looked at each other, but neither of us said anything. It didn't feel worth mentioning. Maybe someone had been here before us. Maybe the water had washed away their return tracks. We went back to camp, built a fire, and settled in for the night. The first few hours were fine. We ate, joked around, and enjoyed being away from everything. But as the night deepened, the unease I had felt earlier came back. The woods felt too still. Even the fire didn't seem to warm the air around us. At some point, Alex mentioned hearing something in the trees. We all went quiet, listening. I didn't hear anything at first, but then, just barely, a sound, soft, slow movement, like someone stepping carefully over dry leaves. Not an animal. Too deliberate. James grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but there was nothing. Just darkness and the feeling of something watching us. We convinced ourselves it was nothing. We had no reason to be scared. There was no one out here but us. But then the feeling changed. It was subtle at first, like the air had shifted, like the woods themselves were watching us. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We went to sleep eventually, all of us packed into the tent. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up to the sound of movement outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the tent. I didn't breathe. The footsteps stopped just outside. Then, the fabric of the tent moved, like something or someone was pressing against it. I wanted to wake the others, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, locked in place by fear. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. No more footsteps, no more movement, just silence. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up to sunlight. I told myself it was a dream. It had to be. But when we stepped outside the tent, the ground was disturbed. There were footprints all around our campsite. They weren't ours. They were fresh. We didn't talk about it. We didn't acknowledge it. We packed up and left without saying a word. The hike back felt longer. The forest felt different, heavier. We moved fast, almost running. By the time we reached the car, my hands were shaking. No one spoke the entire drive home. We never went camping again, and I still don't know who or what was out there with us. I don't know what made me think it was a good idea to camp in that graveyard. Maybe it was boredom, maybe curiosity, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could. The idea had been sitting in the back of my head for a while, and I finally decided to do it on a cold autumn night. I had been camping alone for years, mostly in the woods, sometimes near old abandoned buildings, but never in a graveyard. Something about it felt different. Not supernatural, not eerie in a fairy tale sense, just wrong. A place where people were buried wasn't meant for the living. It was a place of silence, not of flickering campfires and tents. But I ignored that feeling. I picked a small graveyard off a rural road outside a small town I didn't know well. It was a forgotten place, overgrown with weeds, the kind of cemetery no one visited anymore. There were no fresh graves, just old, crumbling headstones, most too worn to read. The road leading to it was narrow, cracked, and lined with trees whose branches tangled like skeletal fingers. There were no houses nearby, no streetlights, nothing but fields and woods stretching into the distance. I parked my truck on the side of the road, grabbed my gear, and stepped through the rusted gate. The ground was uneven. The graves sunk into the earth over time. Some headstones were leaning, others broken in half. I walked deeper in, picking a spot near the edge where a few tall trees stood, their leaves barely clinging to the branches. I set up my tent between two crooked headstones, brushing away dead leaves and twigs before staking it into the soft earth. My boots sank slightly into the damp ground as I worked. By the time I had everything set up, the sky had darkened into a deep, inky blue. The air smelled of earth and decaying leaves. There was no wind, no rustling branches, no distant sounds of cars or people, just silence. I sat by my small fire, eating out of a can, feeling the cold creeping in through my jacket. It wasn't fear I felt, it was something else, an awareness, a feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. I forced myself to ignore it. After finishing my meal, I walked around the graveyard with my flashlight. The light cast long shadows, making the graves look deeper, the headstones taller. I read what little I could from the stones. Most were from the late 1800s, a few from the early 1900s. Entire families buried together. Some had no names, just slabs of stone, as if whoever buried them didn't care enough to mark who they were. I found an old mausoleum near the back, its metal door rusted shut. Vines crawled up the sides, gripping the stone like veins. I shone my flashlight through the cracks in the door, but the inside was just darkness. Stale air drifted out, carrying the scent of damp rock and rot. I stepped away, not wanting to linger near it. Back at my tent, I threw more wood onto the fire and sat down, stretching my legs. My breath came out in white puffs. The temperature had dropped fast. The fire crackled, sending embers floating into the black sky. Then I heard something, a single, sharp sound in the distance. A footstep. It came from the trees beyond the graves. I turned my head, holding my breath. Silence. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe a raccoon. But something about it felt deliberate, slow, heavy. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. Nothing. Just the gnarled trunks and bare branches reaching up like dead hands. I sat back down, telling myself to relax, but my body wouldn't. An hour passed, then two. The fire burned low and I let it. The darkness around me felt thicker now, the cold biting deeper. I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight, wrapping myself in my sleeping bag. My breath sounded too loud inside the thin walls of the tent. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it again. A footstep, closer this time. The same heavy, deliberate sound. My heart pounded. I lay still, ears straining, every muscle tensed. Another step, then another. Stopped just outside my tent. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The fabric of the tent shifted slightly, like something brushing against it. I reached for my knife, gripping the handle so tight my knuckles ached. I waited. Nothing. Minutes passed. The fire outside crackled softly, its light flickering against the tent walls. I stayed like that, frozen for what felt like hours. Finally, I heard it move, not away but around. Slow, measured steps circling my tent. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. I wanted to burst out, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. But something told me not to, so I waited. Eventually, the steps faded. I stayed awake until dawn, When the first pale light crept through the trees, I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out, my knife still in hand. The fire had burned down to cold embers. My truck was still there, my gear untouched, but there, in the dirt around my tent, were footprints. Deep, clear footprints. Boot prints. Not animal tracks. Not bare feet. Boots. Heavy, deep imprints in the soft earth, circling my tent over and over. I followed them with my eyes, my skin crawling. They led toward the woods but stopped just at the edge. There was no trail leading away, no sign of anyone walking off. Just stopped, like whoever it was had stood there, watching me, before vanishing into the trees. I didn't pack up. I didn't eat. I just grabbed my things and left, my hands shaking as I threw everything into the back of my truck. I didn't look back as I drove away. I don't camp in graveyards anymore.